Nobody expected the biggest story of the opening week of the 2026 World Cup to have nothing to do with lifting a trophy, scoring a hat-trick, or producing a last-minute winner. Instead, it arrived in the form of a scoreline that almost nobody believed when it first appeared on television screens around the world. Spain, one of the strongest teams on the planet and the reigning European champions, walked onto the field expecting to begin their campaign with 3 routine points. 90 minutes later, they walked off frustrated after being held to a scoreless draw by Cape Verde. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than one of those classic World Cup upsets that football fans love. A giant fails to beat an underdog, headlines explode, social media celebrates. The smaller nation becomes everyone's favourite story overnight. But the more closely you examine the opening days of this tournament, the more obvious it becomes that this result is part of something much bigger. Because this World Cup has already produced a series of events that feel connected. Players refusing obligations, teams questioning conditions, federations criticising tournament logistics, athletes openly challenging decisions that only a few years ago they would have accepted without saying a word. It almost feels as if the people actually playing in this World Cup are quietly telling FIFA that something about this tournament isn't working the way it was supposed to. And what's remarkable is that these moments aren't coming from one country. They're coming from everywhere. Brazil, Spain, Cape Verde, Iran, several national teams, even players who normally avoid controversy, have suddenly begun speaking in ways that would have been almost unimaginable during previous World Cups. That raises an uncomfortable question. Has football reached the point where even the biggest tournament on earth is no longer completely under the control of the organisation running it? Because once you start connecting all these stories together, the picture becomes impossible to ignore. The opening week of the 2026 World Cup hasn't just been about football. It's become a story about resistance. Not dramatic protests, not players refusing to compete, but dozens of small acts that all point in exactly the same direction. And perhaps the most surprising example came from one of football's biggest superstars. When Brazil faced Morocco, expectations were enormous. Brazil entered the match carrying the usual pressure that follows 5-time world champions everywhere they go. Every touch, every mistake, every chance. Millions of people watching every second. Morocco, however, had no intention of simply making up the numbers. They defended with discipline, attacked with confidence, and eventually took the lead through a brilliantly constructed move that shocked the Brazilian supporters inside the stadium. For a few moments, it looked as though Brazil might actually begin their World Cup with defeat. Then Vinicius Jr. produced the kind of moment that separates elite players from everyone else. Receiving possession near the left side of the penalty area, he drove inside onto his stronger foot, slipped past his defender and curled an unstoppable finish beyond the goalkeeper. It was a goal worthy of the World Cup stage. Brazil were level again. Momentum shifted instantly. The stadium erupted. Commentators praised his composure. Fans celebrated another reminder of why he is considered one of the world's most dangerous attacking players. Ordinarily, that would have been the end of the story. Goal scored, interview given, match continues. Except that isn't what happened. As half-time arrived, officials prepared for one of FIFA's standard broadcast procedures. The designated player would briefly speak with television reporters before returning to the dressing room. It's become normal. Viewers barely notice it anymore. Broadcasters rely on it. Sponsors expect it. Tournament organisers include it as part of the entertainment package surrounding the match. But this time something changed. Vinicius simply refused. Not because he was injured, Not because he couldn't speak, not because there was confusion. He simply decided he wasn't going to do it. According to reports from the stadium, officials reminded Brazil that refusing could result in financial penalties. The response was immediate. Then fine us, we'll pay. But nobody is doing the interview. Those words spread across football almost instantly. Fans began debating the decision within minutes. Some criticised him, many applauded him. Others asked an even bigger question. Why would one of football's biggest stars willingly accept punishment over something that lasts less than a minute? The answer may reveal far more about this tournament than the interview itself. Because from the outside, half-time interviews appear harmless. A few questions, a few predictable answers. Everyone moves on. But from the players' perspective, many have quietly argued for years that these obligations exist almost entirely for commercial reasons. The athletes have just spent 45 minutes competing at the highest level. Their heart rates remain elevated. Coaches are preparing tactical adjustments. Medical staff are assessing fitness. Every second inside the dressing room matters. Yet television contracts require players to stop and speak before returning. That obligation has become increasingly controversial, especially during a tournament already surrounded by debates over player welfare. And that's where this story becomes much more interesting. Long before the World Cup even began, dozens of professional footballers had already expressed concerns about another issue: the heat. Several matches were expected to take place under extremely demanding temperatures. Medical experts warned about the physical risks. Players questioned whether existing cooling measures were sufficient. An open letter circulated calling for stronger protections. Among the requests was a longer cooling break during matches. Instead of brief interruptions, players argued that more meaningful recovery periods were necessary whenever temperatures reached dangerous levels. Many also wanted decisions based on independent scientific measurements rather than fixed commercial schedules. To many athletes, this wasn't simply about comfort, it was about safety. FIFA, however, maintained its existing approach. Cooling breaks remained relatively short, broadcast schedules remained unchanged. Commercial commitments continued exactly as planned. For many players, the message seemed obvious. Business priorities had once again taken precedence. Whether or not that interpretation is entirely fair, it's the perception that matters, because perception influences behavior. And once players begin believing they aren't being heard, frustration starts appearing in unexpected ways. Suddenly, a halftime interview isn't just an interview anymore. It becomes symbolic. A player isn't refusing a microphone. He's rejecting another obligation that he believes serves television more than football. That's why Vinicius's decision attracted so much attention. It wasn't about 60 seconds of conversation. It was about drawing a line. The financial penalty almost became irrelevant. If anything, agreeing to pay the fine strengthened the message. The money didn't matter. The principle did. For years, football's biggest stars have generally accepted whatever obligations accompanied tournaments: media appearances, sponsor events, commercial promotions, additional filming, extra interviews. Most simply complied. But this felt different. It suggested that some of the game's biggest names are becoming increasingly willing to challenge expectations that were once considered untouchable. And that wasn't the only story unfolding. While Brazil's superstar dominated headlines, another team was quietly preparing to create one of the greatest surprises the World Cup has seen in years. Cape Verde entered the tournament carrying almost none of the expectations placed upon traditional football powers. For many neutral fans, simply qualifying represented success. Their squad lacked global superstars. Few players arrived with enormous transfer values. Most casual supporters couldn't even name their starting 11. Meanwhile, Spain arrived carrying completely different expectations. European champions, technically gifted, deep squad, world-class midfielders, elite defenders, one of the favourites to challenge for the trophy. Everything pointed toward a comfortable Spanish victory. Football, however, has never cared about predictions. From the opening whistle, Cape Verde looked organised, disciplined, fearless. Instead of retreating into their own penalty area, they defended intelligently. They frustrated Spain's rhythm, closed passing lanes, won important duels, forced mistakes. Every minute that passed increased their confidence. Spain controlled possession, that wasn't surprising, but possession alone doesn't win football matches. Again and again, Spanish attacks broke down against determined defending. Crosses were cleared, shots were blocked, loose balls were recovered. Whenever danger finally appeared, Cape Verde's goalkeeper responded magnificently. Each save increased belief. Each successful defensive sequence drained confidence from Spain. By half-time, something unusual was happening. The underdogs no longer looked nervous. The favourites looked impatient. And impatience is dangerous. Because once elite teams begin chasing the game emotionally, they often abandon the patience that normally makes them successful. That's exactly what seemed to happen. Spain pushed harder, attacks became quicker, decision-making became rushed. Cape Verde sensed opportunity. Every clearance felt like a small victory. Every successful tackle inspired louder celebrations. Suddenly, the impossible started feeling realistic. When the referee finally blew the full-time whistle, the score remained exactly where it had started, 0-0. For Cape Verde, it felt like a victory. For Spain, it felt like a defeat. But beyond the emotions of the result lies another fascinating question. How did one of the tournament's smallest nations manage to compete so effectively against one of its biggest giants, despite all the challenges this expanded World Cup has introduced? That answer takes us far beyond tactics. Because this tournament is asking every nation to deal with something previous World Cups never demanded on quite the same scale: travel. Constant movement, long flights, different climates, different training bases, different stadiums, 3 host countries, 16 venues, changing routines almost every few days. For wealthy football federations, these challenges are difficult. For smaller nations, they become enormous. Yet somehow, despite every obstacle placed in front of them, Cape Verde proved that organisation, discipline, belief and preparation can sometimes overcome resources, reputation and history. And in doing so, they delivered a reminder that may become the defining lesson of this entire World Cup. Sometimes the biggest victories are achieved not by scoring goals, but by refusing to be intimidated before the match even begins.